When you're standing up to do the right things, some of the things you all have done in your legislatures, what we've done in Florida, you are going to face blowback. They're going to sling arrows at you. They're going to call you names. They're going to lie about you. They're going to smear you. And the question is, are you going to stand your ground or are you going to fold?
And welcome back to America Decides. That was Governor Ron DeSantis earlier today speaking at the annual American Legislative Exchange Council meeting in Orlando. This says his campaign has cut more than a third of its staff, the total number of 38 people, in what is being referred to as a campaign reset. Ken Cuccinelli joins us now. He previously served in the Trump administration as acting DHS Deputy Secretary, and he founded the Never Back Down Super PAC, which is supporting Governor Ron DeSantis' 2024 presidential bid. Good to see you. Thanks so much for being here. Governor DeSantis launched his campaign just 2 months ago, and the campaign is already calling this a reset. Are you concerned about the campaign having to make this kind of course correction already?
No, I'm glad to see them slimming down. I think that when you see it combined with the retail politics they're putting on the schedule, they're doing a bus tour with us in the next few days in Iowa. And what we find is when the governor connects up with people in small groups or one at a time, a few dozen, a few hundred, they warm up to him. And his great record in Florida gets a personal aspect to it. They learn about him paying his way through college and being the only veteran running. Those are important details that help people get to know him. And they put meat on the bones of his excellent record as governor. And we see that growing as a movement. We've knocked on over 1 million doors on his behalf now, and we're seeing the gradual pickup of support across all the areas where we're working, and we're knocking on doors beyond the first 4 states.
Yeah, I want to ask a little bit more about that bus tour in a moment, but what specific changes do you want to see from the candidate?
Well, being at the Super PAC, we play follow the leader here a bit. I mean, I am happy to see the kind of retail politicking I described in the bus tour. I mean, the Super PAC set that up and then invited the candidate, and they either accept or decline. And we like to see that sort of acceptance for those sorts of events. So that kind of grassroots focus is kind of where I come from in politics. I believe in changing hearts and minds one at a time. I believe it works, and I believe that the governor has a great message of accomplishment that matches a great national vision that conservatives are looking for right now. So I think it's a good combination.
And when you look at the polling in early states, it seems like it's been a pretty stagnant race with Donald Trump maintaining a lead. Can you give us kind of a timeline of when you would want to see kind of tangible results or movement from DeSantis?
Well, certainly as we get closer to the end of this year, and we're turning the corner on actual voting in the early 2024 is when we would be looking for that. And that's what we're building toward. Between now and then, there'll be debates of however many types. There'll be an awful lot of other events like not just Alec today, but other incidents. His comments on RFK Jr. today, I thought caught a lot of people's attention. It really plays up his COVID leadership. Where he's shined so spectacularly, especially compared to most everybody else running. Those things come one at a time, and we have 6 months to go. The latest New Hampshire poll had him closing a third of the gap since April, and that's in 3 months, and there's 6 months to go. On that pace, New Hampshire's a dead heat between DeSantis and Trump, and everybody else is far behind. That's not a terrible place to be. Obviously, we want him to win it, and we're going to work very hard to help him win it. But this is going to be a slow building process.
I mean, you mentioned his handling of COVID. That's one area where he's attacked former President Donald Trump over, but really on everything else, especially on the legal woes that the former president is facing. We haven't really seen DeSantis or other candidates really go after Trump on that. I mean, you would imagine that as a big vulnerability for the front runner, Donald Trump. Do you want to see DeSantis go after Trump more forcefully and kind of change the trajectory of this race that way?
Where I think he's going after him on that subject is appointing people like Christopher Wray and then complaining about Christopher Wray and complaining about the deep state when he appointed so many of the people to what he characterizes as the deep state. And then DeSantis then turns that to his own vision for how he's going to uproot the deep state. And I think he has been more comprehensive about that than any other candidate running. You know, Donald Trump just says, I'll fix it in 6 months. Well, you had 4 years and you didn't. And in fact, you appointed many of the people you've been complaining about since you appointed them. So it really shines a light on one of Donald Trump's terrible weaknesses, and that is his incredible inconsistency in his own appointments. And, you know, usually those are people who are entirely supportive of your agenda. And that's what we've seen in the Florida government with Governor DeSantis. We did not see that in the Trump administration. When I was deputy secretary, I had to fight through the White House to try and accomplish the president's own agenda. And that's just not something that Governor DeSantis falls down on.
Yeah, but we haven't really seen those attacks breaking through at this point. I mean, is this something that he needs to be more forceful and overt about? I mean, it seems like a tricky balancing act given that the former president has such a hold on the Republican Party base at this point.
So how aggressive to be in any direction is always a touchy question. And for us at the Super PAC, you know, we follow the lead of the candidate. The governor has dealt with 4 of the largest media markets who've been very challenging to him for the last 5 years. He hasn't made any mistakes in that regard. I think that's good preparation for both debates and for dealing with the president directly, if the president will ever engage directly. So far, he's saying he won't come to the debates, but we'll see if that changes later. And I think the governor is going about this the right way, where he's focusing his criticism on policy differences like COVID, where President Trump has doubled down on all of the bad decisions he made in COVID, and on the many personnel. It isn't just Christopher Wray. We could go through a long list of mistakes by Donald Trump that were sort of known by those of us on the Republican side to be mistakes when he did them, and he went ahead and did it anyway, and then didn't remove them when they were a problem. So, you know, he talks a good game right now, but he didn't deliver the good game that he talks about. And Governor DeSantis did do that. He walked the walk. He didn't just talk the talk.
And we'll see DeSantis and Trump in the same venue later this week in Iowa. Speaking of Iowa, your PAC is hosting DeSantis on a bus tour later this week. You know, federal law prohibits super PACs like yours from coordinating with campaigns. So how exactly is this legal?
Oh, so we can set up events and then invite them to come. They just can't have any input on what happens at the event. For instance, you know, so we set up a bus tour, proposed it to the campaign, and they either say yes or no. And that's why it's legal. They don't have any control over the arrangements made. So we stay completely outside of coordinating. Is that kind of going
right into that gray line?
No, that's not stretching it at all. No, if it were, we're not getting near any gray lines. The ground we're trotting is well trod. We're doing what others before us have done, and the FEC has dealt with all these issues. We're not playing fast and loose at all. We're being very tight to stay inside the lines.
All right, Ken Cuccinelli, we will be watching DeSantis on that bus tour later this week on the ground in Iowa. Thank you so much for your time and being with us today. We appreciate it. We're going to talk now with CBS News political reporter Aaron Navarro joining us now. And of course, he has been covering everything DeSantis campaign for us here. I know you've been following him for a while before he even announced. And I know, you know, there's been a lot of talk about what this shakeup, reset, firing of staff means for the campaign. I know you've been talking to donors, too, and that's often when we start to get some insights about how they're feeling about candidates that they're supporting. What have you been hearing in terms of how they view this reset?
Right, and it's interesting because they're also hearing from the top campaign brass that may not be talking to the press directly. But there was a retreat of these donors, bundlers in Park City, Utah. And the overall message I got from that was the campaign and DeSantis acknowledged that there needs to be a change, that there needs to be kind of a pivot, a reset. They talked about a, quote unquote, meaner, leaner campaign, talked about right sizing. So not explicitly talking about the staff cuts, but alluding to it and also making sure that they are focused on the first four presidential primary states. It was interesting hearing Cuccinelli talk about how the PAC is focused on Super Tuesday, on a lot of that groundwork, and they obviously have a lot of funds to be able to do that. But when you look at the DeSantis campaign and him, they think that all funds, all attention needs to be paid to Iowa and New Hampshire.
So we expect DeSantis to be spending a lot more time in Iowa.
That's
I mean,
right.
you heard Cuccinelli also say that and we've heard this too from supporters of DeSantis, that they want him to kind of be meeting voters one-on-one and kind of focusing there. He's heading to Iowa later this week. He'll be there with a lot of other candidates. I'm curious kind of, and I asked Cuccinelli this, but I'm curious from what you've been hearing from donors about what kind of timeline they want to see some kind of movement here. I mean, are they putting an emphasis on that debate, which is, I think, just exactly a month from now?
That's right. And that was kind of the message from the top brass in the campaign as well, is that this next debate will be a big point for DeSantis and just the race in general. And you look at the big question on whether Trump goes or not. From talking to donors that were at this retreat, it seems that DeSantis, his campaign, are preparing for both scenarios. They're also preparing for whether the candidates that are on stage that aren't named Donald Trump are going to go after DeSantis. And they're expecting, from Chris Christie, maybe Tim Scott. But one other message I got was the campaign wants to make it clear and portray the confidence that this is a two-man race. They're saying, they kind of warned some of the donors, listen, you might see a moment here or there from Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy. It won't last. DeSantis has the funds, kind of the profile that they think can last longer in this race.
So that's really interesting because he came into this race kind of positioning himself as the clear alternative. But, when you spend some time in Iowa and we've been talking to voters, you do sense kind of an openness or eagerness to hear from a lot of different candidates. I'm curious, how the super PAC is, building that kind of ground effort that is so key in a place like Iowa. So even, as the campaign is kind of suffering with spending and money issues, the super PAC is super well funded.
Yeah, and they've been hosting a couple events in Iowa and New Hampshire. I went to the July 4th parade, which is super PAC was put on by them, and it's making sure that the door canvassing operation. So the moments where DeSantis is not there, but his message is still being spread out, is something that super PAC has been handling, which is a bit unprecedented. $100 million going into voter mobilization. And that's kind of been the big focus so far in Iowa and New Hampshire, but also in big delegate states like California, they have staff building up there. So it's interesting to see the difference in the super PAC funds versus a campaign that maybe spent a bit more than it should have.
Yeah, and you bring up a really important point, which is this is all about delegates, how much you can amass, and that's been a key focus of the Trump campaign, having been through this before. I also want to ask you just really quickly about RFK Jr. has been mentioned. You heard Cuccinelli talk about that. What did DeSantis say about him today?
It's interesting. He keeps getting asked, would you make RFK Jr. Your vice president, your running mate on the ticket? And DeSantis and him do have overlap on some of the COVID skepticism. RFK Jr. Obviously has spread and talked about some conspiracy theories that are a bit way out there. But DeSantis today said, after being pressed a bit on whether he would make him VP, that he would appoint him to lead the CDC or FDA, which had many conservatives kind of eyes pop, just given RFK Jr.'s background.
Yeah, given those very, very controversial claims. Well, Aaron Navarro, I know you've been covering all things DeSantis and will continue to, so we should all follow you and your reporting. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.